Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's meeting. For those that don't know me, my name is Keith Rowe. I'm one of the Vice Chairman of the National Jewish Assembly. Before I introduce tonight's guests, there may be some among you tuning in this evening who aren't actually yet members of the NJA. And if you're not, I would please ask you to go onto the website and sign up as a member. It only costs the measly sum of £18 for a lifetime membership, so please don't let anything deter you. And once you're signed up as a member, we can keep you properly informed as to all of our different events, meetings, everything else that's going on. And in fact, before I start my introductions, there are two dates for your diaries that I would like to just mention to everybody. Next week, on the 12th of November at 7 o'clock, we have Brendan O'Neill, who's the editor-at-large of Spiked, a Spectator columnist and an author, and he'll be talking to us on the 12th of November, so please make a note of that. And also we've got another one of our missions to Israel going perhaps early January, and we're looking for expressions of interest. And if you'd like to be a part of that, again, if you're a member, you'll get emails and you'll certainly be able to check up on the website exactly what's going on with that. Once our interview has taken place this evening, there will be an opportunity to ask any questions. So if you'd like to ask a question at any point, please raise your virtual hand by clicking on the button, which is normally at the, depending on what device you're using, at the bottom of the screen. And if you raise your hand, I'll be able to see that and call you to speak at an appropriate time. And I have been asked to please ask you, if you are going to ask a question, to please keep them to questions and not speeches, so that we've got a bit of time and everybody who wants to ask a question will be able to do so. Now, moving on to tonight's guests, I'm going to first of all introduce Jonathan Sacerdoti, who some of you may know. He's a British broadcaster and journalist whose incisive commentary spans television, radio, print and digital platforms right across the globe. He is a trusted voice on international affairs and a sought-after commentator for various prestigious media outlets, including Fox News, Sky News, loads of American ones listed here that I don't even know of, Talk TV, Euronews, and many others besides. He serves as the UK and Europe correspondent for I24 News, and his writing regularly appears in The Spectator, Daily Mail, and Daily Express. He has also been the special correspondent for the Jewish Chronicle. Jonathan's expertise covers geopolitics, Middle Eastern affairs, anti-Semitism, as well as various different analyses. His in-depth analysis of British, European and Israeli politics, alongside his insightful understanding of the British royal family, has earned him quite a reputation as a commentator. He is also, I'm pleased to say, a good friend of the NJA and has appeared in various meetings before. And I thank you again, Jonathan, for conducting this evening's interview for us.
Oh, great to be with you. Thank you.
And Jonathan will be interviewing Major retired Andrew Fox. Andrew is currently a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, following a distinguished career in the British Army, where he served from 2005 to 2021, including 3 tours in Afghanistan, including one with the US Army Special Forces. He served in the Parachute Regiment and the Special Forces Support Group, with various tours in Bosnia, the Middle East and Northern Ireland, and he retired with the rank of Major. Once he'd finished his active service, although this still sounds pretty active to me, Andrew moved over to academia, serving as a senior lecturer in war studies and behavioural science departments at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. He has some pretty impressive academic achievements, holding degrees in law and politics, modern war studies and psychology. And his areas of expertise include defence, the Middle East and disinformation, where he offers commentary and analysis in the media. He is now recognised as a real authority in his field and is a frequent commentator on defence and foreign policy issues across various medias, including the New York Post, the Telegraph and Spiked, bearing in mind that we have the editor of Spiked Online talking to us next week. He has cultivated some pretty big digital followings as well on X, which was previously known as Twitter, and Substack, where you can also see his in-depth analysis on disinformation, defense, and security events in real time. He has taken a very strong stance on the Israel-Hamas war, arguing from a military perspective that the international hostility directed at how Israeli forces in Gaza have operated is entirely unwarranted. So it's going to be very interesting hearing what you've got to hear to us. I'd like to hand over to Jonathan now to conduct the interview this evening. And as I say, if you would like to ask a question, please just raise your virtual hand. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Keith, and thanks to the NJA for putting together this fascinating, hopefully, discussion, because most conversations that I've seen so far with Andrew Fox are indeed fascinating. And perhaps it would be good, Andrew, just to start really with an update from you, because I know that you've just got back from Israel and you also had the opportunity, not your first, to go back into Gaza. And also you spent some time with the IDF in Lebanon, in southern Lebanon, I believe. So can you give us a bit of an update first on what you learnt in that trip, and then perhaps we can discuss more broadly some of the general topics?
Yeah, of course. And thank you for inviting me in for the fulsome and wholly undeserved introduction. That's very kind. So in terms of last week, Gaza was the first one we went to. We hung around on the Gaza periphery for hours because maneuver operations were still ongoing in Gaza, and they had to wait for those to be completed before they could allow us in. And clearly, maneuver operations don't beat to the drum of random visiting academics from the UK. So we got in well after nightfall. So we didn't get a huge view of Gaza. Fortunately, I've been before, and I can tell you how purely appallingly destroyed it is. And I think we need to be under no illusion as to how much damage has been done in Gaza itself. But what's interesting is the fact that maneuver ops are still going on, and they weren't necessarily the Jabalia kind of strike operation that we saw in the preceding days. They were operations to destroy areas where the IDF are now going to operate. So we've got the Philadelphia corridor that everyone's heard of. That's the border with Egypt. We've got the Netzarim corridor, which is where I was visiting, which is kind of the waistband of Gaza, and it separates Gaza City from the conurbations in the south of Gaza. And it provides movement control and a base of operations for the IDF. And what they said they were doing was clearing the Nuseirat corridor, which is to the southwest of where we were, just south of the Netzarim corridor. So it's interesting to me that they're expanding that area of protection, and I'm curious as to why. And I've got some speculation, but I don't have any confirmed fact. What I suspected is to facilitate IDF maneuver punching down into sort of the northern areas of Khan Yunis. What it might also be is yet another base from which to kind of control the flow of population around the Gaza Strip. But it's interesting that we're at this point now in Gaza and we're still seeing these kinds of operations. And of course, we can talk slightly more about Mr. Gallant's departure in the last few days. But I saw his comments today where he said that operations in Gaza had achieved all they reasonably can, and Israel should withdraw. And I'm inclined to agree with him. And we can talk about that in depth as well. But I think he's in the right, and I found these maneuver operations very interesting, the fact they were still going on.
Well, in relation to that, can I just, I know
Yeah.
I asked you about Lebanon. Let's get to Lebanon in a moment, because you've raised a few interesting things there. In relation to that, it seems to me that almost, you get to see things in more detail, both by being there and also by being an expert in these military sorts of maneuvers. And what I've understood almost from the word go from everyone I would speak to, kind of any level in decision making there, is that their plan was always to kind of make Gaza like the West Bank, that they would then be able to clear up the problem and then know that you can't fully destroy insurgencies and an idea, as people put it. So they would just need to be able to go back in as they can in the West Bank at any time and deal with anything that could potentially be difficult in the future. So the corridors are part of that. And it's interesting to hear that you're saying that effectively they're doing more of that than you expected, more than maybe they expected. So is it job done? Is it finished? Or actually, could they just keep doing more and more like that to make the place just more of a Swiss cheese that they can get in at any time they want to and get out?
Yeah, I mean, the issue with that, of course, is that you are destroying people's homes, people's shops, people's livelihoods, and you're going to have to do something with the people of Gaza afterwards. Ideally, for me, that looks like um, providing a security oversight in the way that happens in the West Bank, where Israel can jump back in and give a spanking to Hamas if they raise their heads above the parapet at any occasion in the future. But essentially facilitating an environment where they can rebuild with outside assistance, and hopefully come 20 years time there'll be a place where they are less radical and more inclined to deal peaceably with Israel. That is obviously a very, very distant hope at the moment. And in terms of withdrawing from the Gaza Strip, if we have to strip this back to first principles when we're doing strategic analysis, we have to look at, like, what did you want to achieve when you went in? And it was to dismantle Hamas, provide security for Israel's borders, and recover the hostages. Now, arguably, Hamas are dismantled. One maybe battalion is intact. Even then, that looks pretty much less likely now. We know they're operating now in a more guerrilla, more disjointed way. They're not operating in formed battalions and companies and brigades as they were at the start of the war. We know their command and control has been shattered, which in and of itself, actually, as a side point, does create a problem, because if you're going to try and negotiate an end to the war and what that looks like, you do need somebody to negotiate with. And if you've killed everyone in command, then you've got a bunch of disparate groups floating around the various areas of Gaza with no centralized authority to negotiate with or dictate terms to, depending on how you want to frame it. But arguably, Hamas are dismantled. We're not going to see a situation, I think, where administratively they're going to lose all control over Gaza. Because even if you find somebody else to run the place, the odds are there's going to be a Hamas gunman behind them telling them what to say. So it'll be just a proxy organization, added to which, they already hate Israel. They're not going to change their mind after 12 months of having their entire cities and their entire area in which they live blown to pieces by the IDF Air Force and ground troops. And now, of course, I'm not saying that didn't need to happen. Of course it did. But the idea that we're going to get a friendly Israel-facing Gazan government at any point in the near future, I think, is a pipe dream. So whether it's Hamas in charge or a Hamas proxy in charge or someone else in charge, they're still not going to have any real feelings of affection towards Israel. So you may as well just let a defanged Hamas stay there. The leaders are dead. Sinwar's dead. Dave's dead. Haniya's dead. It's a complete victory. It's in terms of achieving that first goal. The second goal, strategic capabilities. Is Israel's border secure? I would say again, yes, they've achieved that. There's no more facility to make rockets. There's no more facility to fire rockets. That's paid out by the fact that we've seen hardly any rockets from Gaza in the last few months. They've completely annihilated that capability. As long as Israel has secured the border, and we know they've bulldozed that kilometer deep strip around the edge of Gaza. And I would imagine the lessons of 7th October have been very, very painfully learned, and the odds of a penetration through the border, I would imagine, are very, very slim, given the capability hit that Hamas have taken over the last year. Which leaves us to the final objective, recovering the hostages, and that is clearly the one that is not completed yet. 251 originally, now down to 101. The mixture of alive or dead, I've heard estimates. They vary slightly. But the point is there are Israelis and Israeli bodies inside Gaza. Now, do we need to keep military operations going until they're recovered? The point I would make, I think, is that they haven't recovered they haven't recovered the bulk of the hostages using military operations. So the idea that more military operations are going to achieve that, I think, is a bit of a stretch. And so perhaps something else needs to be looked at in terms of how Israel get those back. And we've seen this week $1 million per hostage is now offered by Israel. I'm not aware of any uptake of that offer over the last 48 hours since it was made. And Israel has to make, I think, a very difficult calculation that if military operations don't work and paying people doesn't work, and they decide that that's absolutely something that must happen, that hostage return must happen, they're going to have to make concessions, which is going to be painful and distasteful. So it's a really tricky, the third point of the three is the most challenging and difficult of all of them, because arguably it's completely at odds with the first one of dismantling Hamas. How do you destroy Hamas and get the hostages back at the same time? So very, very, very tricky solution there. But I think that leads me to my argument that the IDF has done all it really can at this point, and we should withdraw and see a West Bankified Gaza Strip.
And do you see then from that visit this just a few days ago, do you see that withdrawal having taken place? Because obviously there's much more intensity in the north now as well, and the IDF is not really an army that's previously been prepared for long wars, and certainly not for multi-front wars of a sort of wars of attrition, let's say. And so, is there a drawing back from Gaza, though it's not officially game over?
No, I mean for the last few months they've been in the kind of three brigades in the Netzeren corridor, three brigades in the Philadelphia corridor with two brigades inside and one brigade sat outside. So six brigades committed uh, in its entirety, and then when they've done ops like the Jabalia operation, they've surged troops in to make that happen. And the IDF is a raiding army, as you say, it's designed for short wars. I think the way they've adapted to the requirements of an enduring campaign has been really impressive. The way they scale the reserves up and down and deploy them and send them home and keep that balance going. I think that's very impressive. And I don't think there's any need to worry about their ability to continue doing that. The only concern for me would be the economic hit of having all those reservists in uniform, away from their civilian jobs, away from their families. Um, and the costs of war are obviously huge. But Israel's economy has proven pretty resilient. That they've only gained 2% in debt to GDP ratio, so in that sense, it's going okay. Um, but yeah, I think there's no sign yet that they're pulling out completely. There's no sign that the very fact that maneuver operations are still going on suggests that that is not a confirmed plan at this stage.
And with the hostages, then, as you said, it seems to be the problem for which there is no military solution as such. Of course, Israel said, especially the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, that it's only the military force that enabled him to negotiate the release of around half of them in that first ceasefire, the only ceasefire. And again, eventually that was broken, let's say, by Hamas, who didn't stick to the deal. They wanted to return, I think, dead bodies at one point rather than live people. And I think maybe what ended that one, if I remember correctly, was actually they started to change the names and the ages of who would be released. But at that point, Israel went back in, sort of full throttle. So if there isn't a military solution, and if military pressure is no longer really able even to bring about a negotiated release, in cold hard terms, do you think we're ever going to see a large number of those remaining hostages rescued or released?
Yeah, it's brutal and it's a challenge. And I think if they do get released, then it's going to come at a great expense to Israel. It'll be involved with withdrawal. It'll involve exchanging um, prisoners for hostages. And it might even involve an exchange of finance of some kind. It's not going to be palatable or nice. So, Israel has to strike this balance between the security of everyone in Israel versus the lives of 50 to 100 hostages. And that's an incredibly challenging decision. And I can't tell, I can't tell Mr. Netanyahu what to do at that point. It's his decision. He's the prime minister. He's been elected to do it. And he draws the line where he sees it fit, with his own political concerns as well, obviously rumbling in the background. Immensely tricky. And my concern over the political shuffling over the last few days is the pressure that will be placed on him from within his own cabinet to go far beyond the West Bankification of Gaza and consider perhaps even taking chunks of it, which I think would be a very foolish idea, from a strategic and international perspective.
In terms of the conduct of the IDF in Gaza, you've obviously written quite a lot about that, and that's been something which has gained you a massive following among people who are keen to understand more details of how the IDF is actually behaving in this war. And you come to it from a position of somebody with no skin in the game personally, let's say, as an academic, as somebody who has been in action yourself, 3 tours in Afghanistan, one attached to the US Army Special Forces. You served in the Parachute Regiment and the Special Forces Support Group. So you're definitely somebody who I think has seen war much closer than most of us would have done. And that's why I think it's very important to hear your analysis of how you think this army, and again, you've commented on the fact that there's a lot of reservists in there, these aren't all professional soldiers. Um, is the IDF the most moral army in the world?
No, I don't like that term. I don't think it's particularly helpful or useful. And it gets up the backs of various people. So I don't use that. What they are is an army that follows the rules. And I think I've seen more than enough evidence to say that they maintain the standard that would be expected of the British Army or the American Army or any other Western army that deployed into a war zone of that kind. Do mistakes happen? Yes, of course they do. Like I'm 100% convinced that some sort of a war crime will have taken place at some point because armies comprise of people, and people react in different and strange ways when they're trained to be aggressive and then placed in a deeply scary and terrifying environment such as war. And also a deeply boring environment at times as well. And one of my favorite quotes is that war is 95% boredom and 5% terror, which I think is an excellent way of describing it. And how people behave in those moments of terror is certainly going to depend very much from individual to individual. So bad things will have happened, and we've seen them happen. And I think it's important that anyone who supports Israel owns those mistakes. You know, we've seen the troops dancing around in women's underwear, which is looting, which is a war crime. We've seen various bits of firing at buildings in Gaza that clearly don't conform to a rule of engagement. So that's not ideal either. Personally, as a British soldier, I don't like the IDF's prisoner handling. And what they certainly shouldn't be doing is taking photos of prisoners of war and then putting it on the internet. Also against the Geneva Conventions. So I think anyone who wants to put the case for Israel has to start by acknowledging that they're not perfect. And I think it's deeply unhelpful when people try and maintain that they are, because it's just unrealistic and it's doing them no favors to say that. But in terms of how they carry out the conduct of warfare, what do they do when people transgress? That's really important. Hamas went on a murder spree, a sexual assault spree, a mutilation spree on 7th of October. I don't see any Hamas military police arresting those people that did that and trying them through the courts. Even those low-level transgressions that don't come anywhere near the crimes of Hamas, the IDF military advocate general get a grip of. There are hundreds of soldiers currently under investigation for misbehavior in Gaza. And that's absolutely right and correct, and as it should be. And that's what a moral army does, whether it's the most moral army in the world or just an equally moral to the international level of expectation. That's what you do. People will make mistakes in combat zones, and they must be held accountable when they do cross the line. In terms of targeting, I've sat in the targeting cell. I've seen rules of engagement. I've seen how they operate. There is absolutely defamation in the public space about how the IDF do that. Particularly, I'm thinking of the 972 magazine article where they allege that Israel is just mass selecting targets through AI and striking them with minimum human oversight. That's just not correct. They follow a 6-step process, which is almost identical to how the British Army do targeting. And I've seen enough examples and evidence of that I'm completely convinced that's how it works. And then on the grounds, they have rules of engagement. They have 62 iterations of their rules of engagement so far, which is far beyond what we had in Afghanistan in terms of iterations. And some of them seem to me to be a lot tighter than we had as well. So is it the most moral army in the world? I don't think that's useful. Is it a moral army? Is it behaving in the correct way? Is it reaching the standards that I would expect of a proper army? Absolutely, yes.
So just to pick you up on something you said there specifically, because I'd like to dig down on it, is the allegation of war crimes. Now, I think that we will all accept that there will be instances of soldier misbehavior, even quite serious violations of the army's code and what have you. But do you think that that will have crossed the threshold for war crimes, sort of serious level international law war crimes that are actually in contravention of the international rules of war, or are they, as you say, cases that are, albeit very serious, grave, often documented by the soldiers themselves, as you say, but not constituting war crimes? I say this because obviously there has been a massive amount of disinformation and twisting of things in the international media and in the international bodies like the UN and the ICJ and the ICC. And so these allegations leveled against Israel are extremely damaging.
Yeah, and I think war crimes, I mean, it's a slightly unhelpful term in that it's so emotionally loaded. Um, People tend to use it quite in a quite cavalier fashion to describe things like you say that are firmly below the threshold of a criminal offense. There's levels to this game, and I don't think Israel has crossed them many times. I mean, there's only so much I can say because it's sub judice. But yeah, there's incidences where it has crossed into war crime threshold territory. But the reason I know that is because the military advocate general told me, which means they're being dealt with correctly and appropriately. And that's probably all I can say on that matter. But it's only a slack handful, and it's not, it's not certainly not endemic or systemic,
Yeah.
as it alleged.
And then to the other side of this conversation, which I think people have made a lot of, to humanitarian concerns. Now, the IDF has a unit, COGAT, which obviously deals specifically with interactions with Palestinians and Palestinian bodies, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. Obviously, it's played quite a part at this point. There have been all these allegations throughout the duration of this war that Israel has not done enough. In fact, that perhaps the biggest culprit in those allegations, in making those allegations, has been the Biden administration, which even now still continues to condition, or at least publicly, its continued support on improving humanitarian aid flowing into the Gaza Strip. And Israel, for its part, fights back and says, we're flooding as much aid in as we can. It gets hijacked. I mean, just in the last few days, I saw that it said here this was a statement from the IDF in a joint operation with the UAE and EU. COGAT facilitated the safe passage of 231 patients and caregivers from Gaza to receive medical treatment abroad. So Israel is constantly trying to flag up the efforts it makes, successful and unsuccessful. And the US, for its part, keeps pressuring it quite understandably to do more. From what you've seen, and from the people you've spoken to there in Israel, who's right?
Yeah, and it's a really tricky one because distribution of aid in a war zone is always a huge challenge. And Israel has taken the decision, rightly or wrongly, not to become a military occupying power. Under the Hague Convention, 1906, I think, or 05 or 06. If I get that wrong, please don't hammer me for it. But the point is, a military occupying power exercises the powers of a government and the powers of a sort of policing force, and actually exercises those powers. Israel's decided not to do that. So they can't be considered an occupying power, which means they're not liable for the distribution of aid. They are liable for the ingress of aid into the area of operations. So have they done that enough? I mean, you can look on the COGAT website yourself. Nobody disputes COGAT's figures. There is enough calories going in for every person in Gaza. So why is there a problem? Well, it's clearly on the distribution side. And there's a variety of problems we could talk about. But the main one is the fact that Hamas use humanitarian aid as their main lever for remaining in control of the population of Gaza. So they seize the aid, they make sure they're okay, and they then use the distribution of aid inside the strip to make sure they retain their power and leverage over the population. And because Israel hasn't occupied in a military sense, they can't really do a great deal about that. As we said earlier, they're not designed for enduring campaigns. The last thing I think they wanted to do was take over and embed themselves amongst the population and face an insurgency exactly like we faced in Basra or Helmand. But in avoiding that problem, they've also run into the problem of how to stop Hamas from an administrative side of things, controlling the population, which is yet another reason why I think military operations should end. They should withdraw, and they should just strike in as needed.
Okay, so let's move on from Gaza and talk a bit about the war in the north with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And just before we do that, you mentioned earlier the firing of Yoav Gallant by Benjamin Netanyahu in the last few days. So let's talk quickly about that because I believe you met both of them in one of your recent trips. Now, it's been widely covered that the two of them just didn't get on. I mean, they didn't get on before this war. Bibi tried to fire him even last year and never gave him the letter because of the protests that took place. this time he is firing him. So I think he's been waiting a long time for this. But it's no secret that they didn't really agree. I believe that Gallant was a proponent for striking first in Lebanon before going in Gaza, and that obviously in that famous meeting only a week or two into the war, that was his suggestion, and there was a strong military preference for that option. But America and other pressures meant that didn't happen, and the decision was not to do that. Did you detect when you met the two, even in their public-facing activities like meeting groups like yours, this animosity, this lack of cooperation?
Yeah, absolutely. And the one day we met them both on the same day, they were counter briefing each other within hours of one another. It was during the debate back in July as to whether to go to Lebanon or not. Gallant was suggesting that they should cease fire in Gaza, give up the Philadelphia corridor, do a deal. And Bibi was adamant that they had to retain the Philadelphia corridor and finish Gaza before going into Lebanon. And clearly, in the meantime, they found a third way, which involved minimal continued maneuver ops in Gaza, and then obviously the fireworks that we've seen in Lebanon over the last few months. So they kind of found a compromised position on that. But we know since then, now that the Lebanon op is basically over, or bar the shouting, the issue of the ultra-Orthodox draft has been a real problem for sort of an internal issue within the cabinet. We know that Bibi's had leaked security stuff, and Gallant's been not a huge complimentary fan of that. And clearly things have reached a head, and Bibi's decided to finally take the action that he's obviously been wanting to for quite a bit of time.
Right. And talking about then the war in the north, again, you were able to go in with IDF forces and witness some of it yourself. How does that differ, just for people watching, from the war that was going on in Gaza? There are obviously two very different styles of battle. This was a war, unlike the one in Gaza, that the IDF have been preparing for since they lost the last one in Lebanon, and therefore that was one of the reasons of obviously why it was a strong military preference to start there, because they really knew what they were going to do. And I think we saw with the pager attack and then everything that followed that they almost had a playbook worked out day by day, blow by blow. Does it look to you from your military perspective drastically different? And can you talk a bit about how the two compared?
Yeah, it's. I think the clever thing to do is go, as we did with Gaza, go back to the strategic goal. And it's very clear for this one that the goal is to enable the displaced people of northern Israel to allow them to move home. That's the end state they're working towards here. And it's taken numerous facets. So they've done the command and control attacks, the pagers being the very most obvious one, but also the death of Nasrallah in an airstrike, and the death of a variety of other, almost every single one of Hezbollah's leadership has now been taken off the battlefield. The second strand is looking at the rocket capability. Now, we know before the war they had 130 to 150,000-ish rockets. Suggestions are they're now down to 20 to 30% of those rocket stocks. But even today, Haifa was taking incoming. That part of the job is clearly not done. And I can see airstrikes from the Israeli Air Force continuing until those rockets stop, or until an agreement is put in place between Hezbollah and Israel. And then finally, it was a mission to go in on the ground and remove what Hezbollah infrastructure they could find in the vicinity of the border with Israel. And that mainly looks like ammo caches, it looks like rocket storage sites, it looks like defensive locations, command and control locations, and of course the tunnels. And the tunnels differ between Hezbollah's and Hamas's, between Lebanon and Gaza, mainly due to the terrain. Now, I think the one thing people often don't appreciate if they've not been there or not seen it themselves is the extent to which Lebanon looks down upon Israel physically. It's higher ground, which gives the ability to shoot downwards, and it's much harder to shoot back uphill. So tactically, it's a much more challenging environment to operate in. The tunnels, I believe, and I have to be careful with this because what I've seen is embargoed, so I need to be just very careful about the exact details I can give you. But the tunnels I've seen are dug into solid chalk, therefore much harder to destroy than dug into sand in Gaza. So much harder to make as well, but much harder to destroy. And some of them go hundreds and hundreds of meters underground. But the IDF have done that. They've just methodically gone along the border and just destroyed everything they found. Uh, some of them obviously incredibly close to UNIFIL bases as well, which isn't, I don't think, a ringing endorsement of UNIFIL's efforts. But it's been a very easy, very successful campaign comparative to Gaza because Hezbollah haven't really stood and fought. Yes, the IDF has taken casualties. They were always going to. Hezbollah are a capable fighting force, but what they haven't done is stayed and scrapped it out. They've left behind certain anti-armor ambush teams, and those are the ones that have inflicted the casualties. But with overwhelming air superiority, overwhelming firepower, the IDF has been more than capable of matching anything that Hezbollah have thrown at them.
You mentioned UNIFIL, who of course were in place in southern Lebanon to try and keep the Hezbollah forces north of the Litani River. Obviously, that never really happened, and that is what posed the threat to Israel from Lebanon. And as you said, they've refused to clear out when Israel has asked them to make way for what it's doing there now as a result of their failure to keep the peace. Can you tell us a bit about peacekeeping forces? How effective can they be? How effective have they been there? Is it typical that they appear to have done, well, nothing, and yet still won't move out of the way when Israel requests them to?
Yeah, and I think the UN sort of peacekeeping mission across the decades has been pretty poor, if we're honest. And mainly that's down to the mandate. There's a very limited amount of power that the UN can give to peacekeeping troops. It can't give the power of offensive action. It can't give air power. It can't give artillery in the way that a conventional national deployment would. So I think the UN has been particularly useless in these sorts of situations. If we go back to Srebrenica and the Dutch battalion that stood aside whilst the Srebrenica massacre happened, we can condemn them all day long, but if they don't have the rules or the power or the legal authority to actually achieve anything, it's very hard to blame them. But the sorry, but the it's my little boy, sorry. He can breach my do not disturb. But yeah, so it doesn't matter how many troops you've got on the ground. If their mandate is useless, they're not going to achieve anything. The more disappointing thing is that they haven't got out of the way. They've decided to take a moral stand against the IDF where they never had the desire to do that against Hezbollah because they knew Hezbollah would hurt them, and the IDF, except by mistake or exception, won't.
And I think that's one of the actually focuses as well on one of the challenges that the IDF and Israel at large has had throughout the last year, is that some forces who you might have assumed, if you don't follow these things too closely, would have been helping or on Israel's side have actually been among the obstacles that Israel had to overcome. So to some extent, that's been the US, though obviously they've been massively supportive as well in other respects. Some extent, the UN, UNIFIL. So in a way, and this touches on your expertise in disinformation and the psychology of how war is presented, do you think that is one area in which Israel has failed, in contrast perhaps to the impressive nature of some of its military activity on the ground? Its enemies have been able to harness networks of media, international bodies that they have somehow infiltrated and turned against Israel, even the news. It seems to have been pervasive in our Western societies. Is that an area where Israel just has been losing? And if so, was there a way they could have done it differently, or is that just how it had to be?
Yeah, it's tricky. And this is frankly, it's a webinar on its own, the answer to this, but I'll try and pull out the one key thing that I think Israel has got wrong. The opposition fight with emotion. Israel tries to retaliate with reason, and that doesn't work. And I would invite you to imagine a disagreement with your partner or spouse where things are getting emotionally heated, and you say something along the lines of, calm down, you're overreacting. Like, how does that go? Okay, and everyone I say that to has the same reaction.
My
It's just
partner's
pouring-
Israeli, so that's
yeah,
I'm
there you
sort
go.
of
Just pouring fuel on the fire. And so when somebody is presented with a picture of a dead child, they have an emotional reaction. That emotional reaction is then hijacked by a malign actor to attach a false narrative. You see that dead baby, you see the fact you're upset. Yeah, that's because it's a genocide. And that means they've taken a position based on emotion. And you cannot reason someone out of an emotionally held position. Whereas Israel has come in and gone, yes, but that airstrike was legal and proportionate, and this is the target we were hitting, and that's justified collateral damage. It doesn't matter because someone's seen a dead child and they're furious about it. And that's the approach the IDF spokesman's department have taken, is just to lay the facts on the table, assuming that people will be reasoned out into supporting their position, when actually it has the opposite effect.
I mean, what other option might they have?
Well, it's nuanced. It's nuanced, and a lot of, if you're trying to win an international information campaign, people need to feel some sort of emotional connection, some sort of empathy for you. And how you go about that is perhaps how you achieve that. So, is having a special forces admiral with a thick Israeli accent standing in front of a camera, coldly detailing what happened, perhaps the best way to engender empathy or sympathy? Probably not. The style of messaging, I think, could be better. And then I think, people need to understand how few people actually know someone who is Jewish in the wider world. Very, very few. Like, how many? You can tell me better than me how many Jewish people there are in the UK. But unless you live in North London or certain areas of the North, you probably don't even know a Jewish person.
I mean, on the other hand, I mean, how
It's
many
therefore very
Ukrainians do
it's
most of
therefore
us
very
know?
easy well, it's therefore very easy to demonize. And very few of us know Ukrainian, correct, but also they had the advantage that they're fighting someone that's almost universally considered to be a bad guy before this war happened. um and it's not quite the same. And I think we also have to be very careful of comparing conflicts, because they all have their own different nuances and differences. But undisputably, the the other factor here is the fact that the Palestinian campaign had 60 nearly years of information ops behind it. So they were already pushing it an open door when this came along.
So one of the things I've been saying on this topic quite a bit, and I wonder what you think of it, is that I think Israel's also had a dual challenge in terms of the communication of the war. So on the one hand, it wants to show what I think is the truth, that it is aligning its actions with international law, that it is going through the required legal steps for targeting and the strikes themselves, that it is doing what it needs to with humanitarian aid, that it is effectively fulfilling the requirements of international law. And you've said that you believe that as well from your studies of what's been going on. But on the other hand, I think it has a very important message that it needs to send to another quite key part of the world, which is its enemies, its Arab enemies. And that is, you try something like this again, and what you're going to get is unrestrained wrath of a country with a formidable military force. But then, in an aside to the rest of the world, but all within the bounds of international law. So it's quite a difficult job to try and prove that you are the toughest, scariest, if one of the smallest countries in the region. And then at the same time, to convince The Guardian and the New York Times and the UN and just about everyone else that you're also massively concerned with humanitarian aid and you're not really out to do too much damage and what have you. Is it possible to conduct a war with those two magnifying glasses effectively on every action?
Yeah, it's really tricky, and I've heard that phrase before, as Israel wants people to feel sorry for it and fear it, which and it's mutually exclusive. And I think since 1967, Israel shook the underdog tag. Um, and we can kind of, I think, accept that that's never coming back. So what do you want to present, and who's the most important audience you're talking to? Um, and again, I can't really make that decision. Has anything seriously bad actually come of losing the information war? Well, Israel hasn't stopped operations. There was a 4-month pause between Khan Yunis and Rafah, which was deeply unhelpful and unnecessarily prolonged the war. There was the lack of provision of £2,000 bombs for a while, but that didn't really achieve anything practical on the ground. The real sort of downside has come from certain Western countries who don't really matter, frankly, like us, the Irish, Norwegians, like who cares? Where we're deeply unimportant partners for Israel. The only one that matters is the US, and they've stayed very, very tight over the last year, which just leaves us with the ICC and ICJ cases, and clearly they're absolutely vexatious. But I don't necessarily trust them as courts either. So it might still go against Israel, deeply unfairly as that is. But really, in terms of affecting the outcome of the war, it hasn't had a huge effect, which, for all that we find it frustrating, and for all that the diaspora has to deal with the anti-Semitism that comes for it, and for all the abuse that I as an analyst have to take online, actually it doesn't really achieve a great deal other than make people feel good about each other.
Well, that's a good opportunity. Just, I think I'll ask you one more before we open up to the virtual audience, who I know have got lots of questions as well. But it's a good opportunity to say thank you, actually, on behalf of I think many people here, because as I said, you don't officially have skin in this game. You're not Jewish. I'm fortunately, it sounds like you are. Well, I know you are also. I hesitate to use the word victim for a big, strong military guy, but a victim of some of the anti-Semitism that is leveled at us is now leveled at you all the same. And looking forwards now to a Trump presidency, do you think we've seen any clues as to how the US's support might change come January? And do you think there are any surprises that could happen as a sort of parting gift from the Biden administration before then? And have you had any clues from Israel during your trips and your discussions as to what the different possibilities and eventualities are, conditional on everything I just mentioned?
No, I mean, there's a certain positivity that I've detected amongst the sort of pro-Israel crowd. How justified that is, I think, remains to be seen. We know Trump has declared that both Ukraine and the war around Israel will be done within months of him taking over, which is all very well, but that still needs to have a situation at the end of it where Israel is happy with the outcome, and a forced ceasefire, I don't think, is particularly helpful at this stage. So that's not necessarily a good thing. Likewise, it's not necessarily a good thing if Trump just says, right, gloves off, Israel, go and level the place even further than you have. I mean, that's not going to win Israel any long-term strategic partnerships. It's not going to make the Abraham Accords develop at any point in the near future if the whole Arab world hates you for smashing apart Gaza more than you had to. So, I think we also need to accept that President Biden has actually been an exceptionally good ally to Israel over this. And I think this is fairly controversial because Biden has had to make certain noises to placate certain parts of his voter base. So he's had to make those noises about Israel, whilst at the same time the US military has been in absolute lockstep with the IDF for the duration of this war, to the point where I know there are American troops in Israel now with the missile defense systems. There's B-52s lining up at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar to prepare to do what needs to be done in the Middle East. There is, one, I'm not sure if the second carrier group is still there, but there were 2 carrier groups there for a while. America has been a phenomenal ally to Israel under President Biden, and I think he probably deserves a little bit more credit than he's getting for that.
Well, that's definitely interesting, and I suppose for what it's worth, I would agree a bit. But I think I think America's been sort of strangely split personality on this. I think you're right that when it came to it, it hasn't stopped Israel acting, which previous administrations did. They were far less patient with Israeli wars. I think perhaps the trigger for this one was so much greater that there was an obligation on America's part. But and yes, absolutely, there is a lot to thank the Biden administration for, but there's also quite a lot, I think, to criticize it for. As you said, I think there are some drawn out bits of this war that wouldn't have happened without the US's insistence on things like that disastrous floating pier, which actually ended up killing this week one US one US soldier died of his injuries from it. It was always a ridiculous idea. It just cost millions and never really worked. But gestures like that, I think, helped stall some of the military action that could have really happened much faster. And again, a lot of the performative insistence on humanitarian concerns on the part of America, perhaps when they knew Israel was doing as much as it could, holding back weapons, though not necessarily essential ones. So I think there's a case to be made on both sides, and probably you, like I, have heard it made very strongly on both sides by different people, often depending on their politics. But at this point, let's let everyone else who I know probably is desperate to ask questions. I'm not sure technically how that's going to happen because that's not my job, but I know that here is Keith, so that is good news. And Keith, perhaps, and at this stage, let me thank you for a fascinating conversation, which I hope will now carry on, and probably will get the really good questions from the audience of experts.
Yeah, well, you've got me back. Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Major Fox, for fascinating insight into what's been happening across the Middle East. I'm hoping to see some yellow virtual hands raised any minute. There's been plenty of questions asked and comments made in the chat boxes, but please, if you'd like to put your questions to our guest this evening, please raise your virtual hand and I can call upon you. Gosh, you must have answered everybody absolutely fully to the point that they've got no further questions. But hang on, we've got Leonid Yanovich. Please unmute yourself, Leonid, and ask your question.
Good evening, and thank you for standing up for us in the information war. Soviet Union were complicit in assisting the Holocaust when they didn't counter German anti-Semitic propaganda in the territories occupied by the Nazis during the war. Equally, Western governments don't do anything to counter the pro-Palestinian propaganda. Do you think there is a place for a team like there was a COVID-19 team spreading unified information about the vaccines, about distance, something similar to happen to distribute from the government true information about the genocide and the lack of it? Thank you.
Yeah, and it's a really tricky one because I think you'd be surprised sometimes at how little attention politicians who should know things don't know them. I was speaking to a cabinet minister in the last administration about this topic, and he was in a position where he really should have known. And halfway through the briefing, he stopped me and asked, "Who is Sinwar?" Which was telling, I think, about the level of knowledge people had about this conflict prior to 7th of October last year, and subsequent to 7th of October. Clearly, everyone is an expert on this topic. How do we counter it? Well, look, I think it's amplified by social media. It's amplified by malign actors in the regular media. And it's a really tricky one. And I don't have you a discrete answer. But what I would say is it's literally my next project at the Henry Jackson Society. So subscribe to the Henry Jackson Society, and sometime around February next year, I hope I will have a swept up holistic answer for you. But yes, it does need something doing. It needs people willing to speak the truth, and we need to find a mechanism of delivery that actually hits home. Because if someone's at zero, they don't care about this stuff. And actually a lot of people don't. yes, it's a big deal for the Jewish community, for people who professionally study the Middle East. For the pro-Palestinians, they are now at -20 when it comes to this. So we've got 0 doesn't care, -20 is you're a huge pro-Palestinian, and this crowd here are probably the +20s in terms of supporting Israel. Now, are we going to get someone who is -20 to ever be +20? Almost certainly not. What I think we need to do is find a way to get them from -20 to -15 or even -10, where they're not going on the streets and they're not making Jewish people feel alienated from their own capital city, where they're not going on the internet and spreading lies. How do you bring them from -20 extremism back towards the 0? Even if they never quite get there, we need to develop a solution that allows us to do that. But that is far more easily said than done.
I'm actually just something you said there just reminded me of a funny story as well. I found myself on Sky News with a member of the House of Lords, let's say, who'd been on the Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, senior Minister of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs at one point. And it was a weird show where they got us to do 2 segments of 10 minutes each, and in between it was a good 20 or 25 minutes that we were just sitting outside the studio having a fight, which would have been much more interesting television. And she kept saying, "Oh, Netanyahu's war, Netanyahu's war, get rid of Netanyahu." And I said to her, "So who would you prefer?" And after we went round in circles several times, I realised she couldn't name a single other Israeli politician or a single opposition politician. And I think it's exactly right. Never mind who is Sinwar. We have people in real positions of influence who have absolutely no idea what's actually going on. And I think that the media that we've had largely here in Britain and elsewhere in large parts of the world is just not covering the war in any real sense, which is why we're very grateful for online, that we can pick up proper analysis from people like Major Fox. So I would say it's very important not to just be ill-informed by the usual dodgy sources.
Absolutely. Les Bloom, please unmute yourself. Can you unmute yourself, Les?
Unmute. Okay.
Yep.
Can you hear
So
me?
please ask your question.
Okay. All right. Well, my question is, well, thank you very much for taking time to talk to us. Very interesting what you had to say. I do feel though you're preaching to the converted. I mean, everybody here must be on yours, as indeed you're on our side. And it does disturb me that although Israel, I said so in the chat, may be winning the ground war, the internet war and the media war is going very badly against Israel. So have you got any thoughts on that, and indeed how we counter that?
Yeah, I mean, it's again, I'm going to go back to the point I was making earlier, and that is that so few people know a Jewish person, and that makes them very easy to demonize, and therefore it makes the state of Israel very easy to demonize.
Yeah.
As a state of this entity that you don't know and haven't heard really anything about, particularly from a British perspective. And I think it's different in America. It's a different set of problems. But I think trying to establish some sort of connection to Israel, like showing it how it really is to people. I mean, I sent a friend of mine in America a picture from Tel Aviv of a bunch of skyscrapers, and she was like, "Wow, I didn't realize the Middle East could look like that. I thought it would be mud huts or something." She was genuinely shocked that Tel Aviv is a proper city, and that's the level of ignorance we're dealing with here. Most people are taking positions on this conflict from a position of near total ignorance of not only the Middle East, but also warfare, but also of never having met a Jewish person. And it's a powerful cocktail. And so education is a big piece here, and showing people what Israel is, who Jewish people are, I think that's a huge first step. Trying to find some sort of emotional connection, some sort of, look, they're just like us. It's just like a Western country. It's not like the Middle East in the sense it's not like the Arab Gulf states. It's not like Afghanistan. It's just a normal, nearly European country. And I think the single best PR thing for Israel in the last year has been Eurovision. And if you look at how well they did in the popular vote, that I think that just proves my point that if you can find that point of connection, all of a sudden people will support you.
Thank you. Barry Epstein, are you able to put your video on as well so we can see who you are, Barry? Please ask your question, Barry. Barry Epstein. No. No
Now,
unmuting. Ah, okay.
can you hear me now?
We can hear you. Can you show us who you are?
Unfortunately, not tonight because I'm tech phobic.
Okay.
One of the things I'm very good at, Major Fox, is that I became a very good amateur historian when I was at school. I'm obviously not a Christian person, but I always came top at New Testament religious knowledge. And I wiped the floor with my Christian friends. The headmaster asked me why, and I said to him, "Sir, one should always know the other chap's story." The problem that we have in UK schools, particularly since the 50s, is that nobody appears to have opened a history book. If they did, they would understand the evolving history of the Middle East. We've got a lot of opinion formers on the line tonight, and you should persuade the Ministry of Education in this country to put history back as a major subject on the school curriculum. And also, if they did, we would stop all this nonsense, this self-flagellation that is now occurring as a legacy of empire. Everybody was at it.
And
So
I
Have you got a
out.
comment? Have you got a comment on that? I don't know how much we can influence this government and their education policy, given their economic policy. So
We can by opening our mouths. History books cost nothing.
okay, let's see what Major Fox has to say. Any
Yeah,
comment on
I agree. I agree. And you know, the lack of historical knowledge, when people are giving comment with such force and vigor, just emphasizes my point. They're taking positions based purely on emotion and almost nothing based on knowledge or rationality, which is really hard to get past. I think a certain tranche of people, it doesn't matter how much education you give them, they've made their minds up and it's not going to change. But I think there is a strategic challenge, both for potentially for British Jews, but mainly for Israel, to try and tell their story better in future. But they're now starting from 100 meters back in a 100-meter sprint race. They've now got 200 meters to go, where everyone else is the other side. It's just going 100 meters. So it's going to be a tricky one. And we need to think a lot more strategically in 20-year blocks about how Israel messages itself to the world to make sure that should anything requiring military force happen in future, they're not on the back foot from the word go as they happen this time.
Thank you. Freddie Dalla, can you unmute and have your question, please?
Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you very much for an enlightening evening. My question is to Major Fox. Do you believe the hostages, in all of them or some of them, have been smuggled into Sinai?
No, I don't think there's any evidence to support that.
Because they are the joker in the pack
They are
for
very much
Hamas.
so. And this war would be over were it not for their presence. It would have been over months ago had it not been for the hostages. I know Bibi was saying it was a concern of his. I know when the IDF went to Rafah, they found all the tunnels to Egypt filled in, and were not viable for that sort of hostage level extraction. I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that they're anywhere but still in Gaza, but there may be evidence out there that I haven't seen because it's classified by the Israelis. So the answer is I don't know, but I've not seen any evidence to suggest it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nicole Lampert, please. Can we see who you are as well? Ah, hello, Nicole. Please ask your question. Please unmute.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Hi.
Far away.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you, Jonathan. It's been really interesting to hear from you this evening. I want to just to let you know, Andrew, there are 270,000 Jews, so there's not very many of us to go around. How you talk about kind of starting on the back foot, but I would say the back foot is kind of 2,000 years old. In that we're dealing with anti-Semitism in this country that is kind of unacknowledged and probably unrealized. How can we do a better job, even in this country, when we've got people like Jeremy Bowen and people like that who do know the region and do know the story, but deliberately distort it?
Yeah, that's exceptionally challenging. And if I had an answer for you for that was definitive, I'd probably be a lot wealthier than I am. And would be doing a lot more media consultancy as a genius. Yeah, how do you deal with that subversion? I think the BBC's harder because they're state funded for the most part. There is a significant amount of BBC funding that doesn't come from the license fee. But certainly with Sky, I think we should be seriously looking about how much Qatar is allowed to invest in our institutions. Somebody in the chat group has asked, why do academics get it so wrong? And I'll tell you exactly why. It's because they're bought and paid for. And I can think of one academic who does a lot of work for the BBC, who is absolutely tied to Qatar by professional history. And there is no question that his views are coloured by that and their financial input into his particular institution. So I would, Qatar have been utterly subversive this entire conflict, and they're a major accelerant for a lot of the disinformation that's out there. So that's how I would start. I would start looking at who funds these media companies and why they're taking the positions they are. We know that certain of the really big, nasty disinformation accounts are funded by Iran. The Iran leaks, the names are there in black and white. You can find it for yourself. So the first step to preventing subversion is stopping giving our enemies access to our media institutions and our academic institutions. And until that happens, it's going to be very difficult to do anything about it.
Thank you. Richard Galber, please unmute. Richard, can you please unmute? I can't hear you. That's it.
Hi. My question is about the ICC and the ICJ. The ICJ and the ICC don't seem to actually follow legal procedure because it's too much politically driven. Do you have any ideas, with your knowledge of law and warfare, the best way of actually trying to, what's the word for it? Fight them, I suppose is the right word for it.
I mean, my bachelor's in law was awarded in 2003. And I've not done any legal stuff since my very brief mini pupillage stint. So I'm not going to pontificate on how we deal with the ICC and the ICJ. But the ICC is the easier one of the two to handle because the accusations against Gallant and Netanyahu are absolutely demonstrably nonsense. And that can be fairly easily proved. And if you want to check out the submission that we wrote for that, for the high-level military group, if you Google high-level military group ICC, you can read our submission there. It's in black and white. There's no forced deliberate starvation. There's no siege. There's no war crimes in the sense that targeting is any different to how the West would do it or how anyone else would do it. And you can read all about the mechanisms that the IDF has to hold its soldiers to account. So it's all in there. The ICC, I think, should go nowhere. It can't. It's just factually false. It doesn't even come close to a threshold where they would have a reasonable chance of conviction if we're going to use civilian criminal law thresholds. The ICJ, I'm concerned about. I mean, if you look at who makes up the ICJ in terms of the actual the judges at the moment, they're a pretty ropey bunch from a ropey bunch of countries, and there's every chance that might just go in with a political verdict rather than one that's based on legal fact. But I'll leave you with this when it comes to the genocide case. 42,000 people have died, over 66,000 have been born. in Gaza since the start of the war. They're actually on a net plus of people who are in Gaza since the start of the ground operation on 26th of October last year. And if Israel are trying to destroy the Palestinians in whole or in part, they are doing a truly dreadful job over 12 months. Therefore, I put it to you that it's not happening.
Thank you for that.
And can I just add a quick comment there, which is I would say also that, I mean, we mentioned earlier the kind of two step forwards, one step back of the US attitude. So that's been, the ICC is one good example. I was reading an interesting piece by Eugene Kontorovich actually on just this. It was his kind of list of things that the Biden administration has done wrong. And one of those is cancelling Trump's sanctions on the ICC and then refusing to support the bipartisan legislation holding the ICC officials accountable after they sought to indict Israeli officials for defending the country from Hamas. And of course, that is, I think, something that the US could have been much more robust on, because how can you tackle the ICC and the ICJ? Well, you can tackle it by being America. So in the same way that how can you deal with a problem like Iran? Well, by being America. Israel can't really deal with Iran all on its own. It needs some form of US support, whether it's weapons or actual proper full-on support. And similarly, I think Israel can't defeat the ICC and the ICJ alone. It can defend itself in them. But as Andrew rightly said, it's dubious whether they'll actually follow good, solid, logical, legal procedure and actually come out with a fair result. So the case could be strong, but that doesn't for 1 minute mean they're going to win. Whereas I think America is in a position, and so maybe that's one of those maybes that we have to cling to with a bit of hope. Maybe Trump will make a change, because I think that I'm going to say something a little bit political, but maybe Donald Trump recognizes that the ICC, as Eugene says, is the international version of the lawfare that's been directed at him as well. So the use of law against your enemies, whether it's the Democratic Party against Donald Trump or whether it is the ICC against the state of Israel, is something which is increasingly problematic in today's world, I think. So hopefully America may be able to help going forwards in that respect.
Thank you. I'll take two more quick questions. Stuart Smith, if you could unmute, and perhaps we could see you as well, please. Please ask your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, actually, I was about to ask about Iran because nobody really mentioned it up until just then, and they are behind the whole war, and I do think that America could have said to Iran, right, if you don't call off Hezbollah, if you don't get Hamas to release the hostages, then we're going to take some serious action against you. That the Biden administration could have said that all along, and I wonder, how much people think that. I think there's a good chance that Trump could do that, but obviously he's not going to be actually the president until January. But I would like to think that he's going to take a very tough line against Iran, and that could get things over very quickly. I don't know if that's I don't know what other people think about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. That was never going to happen under Biden. The continuity Obama White House was never going to stray away from the Obama doctrine in the Middle East. Useless though it was, it was an article of faith that de-escalation and negotiation are better than bombs and bullets, which they are for the most part. But it comes to a point where you need the violence as a lever of international power, or even just the threat of violence. And without that having been there, there's been no deterrence in place for the Iranians. I think deterrence will return under Trump. I think it's what we saw last time. And it's not so much the ability to bomb the hell out of Tehran that we want from Trump. It's the ability to force Iran to back down due to the threat of force. That's by far the better option. And I think with Trump, that threat is credible, and they have the capability. So if I was Iran, I would be backpedaling in the face of that.
And it's worth saying that, I mean, there are some reports, we don't know about it yet, but Brian Hook, I read, is being reportedly tapped to assemble the new State Department for a potential Trump team. And he's important because he's an architect of that maximum pressure strategy involving sanctions and covert actions and targeted operations against Tehran. And so that could be, if it's accurate, a useful sign of exactly what Andrew just said, I think, which is that a Trump administration may be far tougher on Iran, and it doesn't have to be in the form of all-out war and getting involved in wars, because let's remember, Trump is a president. He's often unpredictable, but one of the things we can predict about him is he's quite averse to war. The guy gets elected on promising to end wars, get out of wars, and I think that's probably quite accurate. He doesn't really want to start a massive war with Iran, but there's many ways to skin a cat.
And our final question this evening, please, from Julian Pollard. Please unmute. Can you hear me, Julian? You're muted. That's it. Thank you. Please ask your question.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Major Fox. Really interesting talk. I just want to touch on two points very briefly, which are the connection between the BBC and the use of lawfare. As you will be aware, we've had two reports on the activities of the BBC, one by a guy called Cohen and a lengthy report by Trevor Asserson, who is a lawyer based in Israel. A detailed, cogent, analytical assessment of the BBC's reporting. The BBC have given a two-line response saying that they're not interested in the report because they disagree with the methodology. My understanding is that the government will not take on the BBC. It's just too hot a political potato in relation to these allegations. And therefore, it's possible, although I don't know for sure, it's possible that this matter will come to court because Asserson will take the matter for judicial review to the High Court. So these issues may become in the public domain sooner rather than later. But of course, the BBC has form. They've sat on a report called the Balin Report for 20 years or more, where they have not disclosed this information. They have now two cogent reports in front of them, which are in the public domain, so people can see exactly the way in which this bias has been logged and recorded, and they're not interested to engage. So it's a difficult situation, and it may be that only the courts can actually adjudicate on the BBC. And of course, with the charter renewal coming up in a couple of years' time, this could become a very hot political potato, and that's another reason probably why the government would not step in. And I've asked my MP whether they would. He's a newly elected Labour MP. He's ducking and diving at the moment, but I suspect that will be the approach of most of the MPs. But it may be that it will come to the courts anyhow.
Cool. Is there any question?
Well, there wasn't a question. I just really wanted to share that information. Really,
and just to, I mean, I don't disagree with much of what you said. Trevor, when he launched that Asserson report, was quite clear that he expected the BBC to do what they've done, which is just say, "Oh, I don't like it." And one of the ways in which they've criticised it, by the way, is that it made extensive use of AI, and they were kind of very dismissive about that. I must say that actually one of the things that AI is particularly good at, and that they harnessed in this, and I've spoken with some of the team that did the actual AI work. They're, professor level academics. There were something like 30 of them involved. AI is really, really good at analysing large bodies of text. And now that we have these large language models, they're actually extremely effective at detecting sentiment. But the BBC rejected the idea outright that you could see if they're doing what they should by assessing sentiment in the reports. But Trevor had always said that his intention was to take this to judicial review if the BBC rejected it, as they have done. So I hope, I haven't spoken to him since they've made that statement, but I do hope that is exactly what's going to happen.
Well, the other problem, of course, is a lot of the BBC commentators have personal axe to grind. They have personal connections with Palestinians, and I've got no problem with that, but these are conflicts of interest which should be disclosed. And someone like Bowen had a cameraman shot dead next to him, so he has very strong emotional feelings. And I suspect that the majority of people listening to Jeremy Byrne are not aware of those personal feelings.
Well, thank you both, gentlemen, very much. I'm now going to hand back to Steve Winston, our Managing Director, just to give a final thank you to you both. And from my point of view as well, thank you for your great insights this evening. Steve.
Thanks, Keith. Yes, I echo what Keith said. It's been a fantastic insight. Jonathan, thank you once again for joining us and giving your fantastic journalistic skills to this evening, for bringing them to this evening's event. You know exactly how to cut right through with your questioning to all the relevant details that everyone really wanted to hear this evening. So thank you on behalf of us all here at the NJA. And Andrew, thank you. You know, from the very beginning when I reached out to you first via Twitter, and you came straight back to me, and you said you'd be honoured to speak to us, and so you know you've been what we call a mensch throughout, and you know it's you must have heard it quite often, but you know on behalf of us as Jewish people, your support, you know, as a non-Jew, it's valued perhaps even more, if I can put it like that. It's, you know, it's sincerely appreciated. And thank you for your very pragmatic insights this evening. And they have been, I found them very pragmatic and very insightful, very useful. And so on behalf of us all here this evening, and on behalf of the NJA, my team, and our advisory board, thank you very much for giving up your time. What I would like to just show you on the screen, Andrew, is that, as you know, last night we held an event that was, we held it with the World Zionist Organization. And the World Zionist Organization, you may already know or you may not, was created in 1897 when Theodor Herzl held the First Zionist Congress in Basel. And so it's the primary Zionist organization in the world, and it's a national institution in Israel, and they have bestowed an award for you, which I'm going to share on the screen, and then I'll be in touch outside of this and arrange to have it sent to perhaps the Henry Jackson Society or another address that you feel comfortable to share. But let me just share it on the screen for you. And I hope you can see it there. And I'll read out to everyone. A salute to Israel, Andrew Fox, in recognition of your unwavering advocacy and support for Israel and the Jewish people since October the 7th, 2023. Together we will prevail. We are stronger and more united thanks to you. It ends off in Hebrew saying, Am Yisrael Chai, and it is signed by Matan Bar Noy, who is the head of the WZO's delegation to the UK and Europe. It's signed by Yaakov Hagoel, who is the current chairman of the WZO, and it's signed by Neria Meir, who is head of the diaspora department in the WZO, and who himself has been actively serving in Gaza and more recently in Lebanon since October the 7th. So I just thought I'd share that this evening with you. And I'll be in touch separately to see how we can get this to you.
No, I'm incredibly humbled and touched. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure and well deserved. And, you know, once again, I say thank you on behalf of us all here this evening. Keith, back to you.
Well, that's it for this evening. Thank you all for your attendance, and hope to see you next week at our next meeting. Thank you all. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.